The boy had learned to read the silence before the question came. It arrived the way cold always did in Minnesota, not announced, not apologetic, just present, filling every space where warmth had been. The other boys at the one-room schoolhouse on Prairie Road kept a particular silence for Wilhelm Brauer, a practiced pause before the cruelty that was almost worse than the cruelty itself because it gave him time to brace for something he could never quite brace for. He was standing near the wood stove on a Tuesday morning in October, holding his lunch pail, watching frost patterns on the single-glass window when the silence came. "Your house sleeps on top of a cow barn, don't it?" Thomas Larkin, the blacksmith's son, delivered it the way boys deliver things they've rehearsed with performed indifference to where it lands with the calibrated carelessness of someone who wants to cause pain without looking like he intended to. The other boys laughed the way they always did, the nervous laugh that grants permission, the laugh that says someone else has said the unsayable and now we can all breathe and enjoy it. Wilhelm didn't answer. He set his lunch pail on the bench beside him. He looked at the frost pattern on the window for exactly 3 seconds. He counted the way you count when you're keeping something inside your chest by sheer arithmetic. And then he walked out of the schoolhouse without asking permission and didn't look back. He walked the 2 miles home with his collar up and his jaw set. The prairie in October had a particular quality of light, low, and golden, and utterly uninterested in the affairs of 13-year-old boys. And the grass was silver at the edges where the night cold had already visited and not entirely left. He could see his father's homestead from a half-mile out the way he always could now, because there was nothing else on Prairie Road that looked remotely like it. Every other settler had built the way. Settlers built a cabin rising directly from the earth, maybe a stone foundation, 2 feet high, maybe wooden posts if the man was in a hurry or short on time, which all of them were. His father had built something that looked from a distance like a cabin that had somehow grown up out of a small fortress. The stone walls rose 12 feet before the log structure above them even began. 12 feet of fitted granite rising from the flat Minnesota earth, and inside that stone enclosure, 10 head of cattle and horses arranged in clean straw bedding, and above them the family, 1 man and 1 boy, that was supposed to be living a normal and unremarkable frontier life. Wilhelm climbed the half-finished exterior staircase to the top of the east wall and sat with his legs dangling over the edge and looked down at his father. Henry Brauer, Hans always. Hans, the name his father had called him before Hans was old enough to know. There was a longer version was fitting a piece of granite into the last gap on the north wall's ventilation system. He was 38 years old and built like the walls he made, not wide and not tall, but assembled with a density that suggested no material had been wasted anywhere in his construction. He had wide, rough, accurate hands, the hands of men who learn their craft by standing beside someone who has already made every mistake. And he worked with the particular concentration of a man who is simultaneously calculating and thinking 3 steps ahead, while his hands occupy themselves with what's in front of them. He had been working since before Wilhelm left for school that morning. He would be working after Wilhelm went to bed that night. This was the consistent fact of their lives since the foundation laying had begun in August, and before that it had been the fact of their lives since the previous winter when Hans had spent the cold months drawing plans on brown paper by lantern light while the wind hit the temporary shelter they'd been renting from a neighbor down the road. He didn't look up when Wilhelm sat on the wall. He knew the boy was there. Some awareness had developed in Hans over the 3 years of doing this alone, a peripheral knowledge of Wilhelm's location and state that operated independent of his eyes the way a man on a ship learns to feel the deck even when he's looking at the horizon. In the breast pocket of his canvas work coat moved from coat to coat through every season. Never repacked or reconsidered was a small notebook bound in brown calfskin worn almost black with handling. His grandfather, Ezra Brauer, had given it to him on the morning of Hans's 20th birthday, not as ceremony but as a practical transfer, the way a craftsman hands over a tool when he determines the younger man needs it more than he does. The notebook held 40 years of Ezra's observations about houses and heat, about the behavior of stone under load, and over time about the way animals breathe, and what that breath does to the temperature of an enclosed space above them, about the specific mathematics of firewood consumption relative to structure design. The handwriting was precise throughout, economical, the script of a man who didn't waste words because he considered waste in any form a character flaw. The final entry, written in the spring of the year Ezra died, was indistinguishable from the first, same careful hand, Same steady pressure, same absolute absence of self-pity or sentiment. Don't explain. Winter will do the explaining for you. Hans read that line each morning before he picked up his first tool. Not as inspiration and not as comfort, as reminder. The argument had been made by the man who came before him. Hans's job was not to repeat it, but to build the proof. He had been born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on land his grandfather had farmed, and his father had farmed after him, in a county where the Pennsylvania Dutch tradition of bank barn construction had been established for over 100 years, before Hans was old enough to understand what he was standing in. Ezra had built the first Brower bank barn in 1815 on a modest rise outside Strasbourg, using techniques he had absorbed from neighbors whose own fathers and grandfathers had developed the approach through the hard education of survival. The structure was designed so that the livestock quarters occupied the ground level, built into the hillside for natural insulation, and the family's living space sat above on the second level, warmed from below by the combined body heat of the animals retained by thick stone walls that absorbed warmth during the day and released it steadily through the night, creating a thermal stability that no wood stove could replicate. Hans had grown up walking on warm floors in January. He had done it so consistently from infancy that he had no framework for what its absence meant until he moved somewhere it didn't exist. He had come to Minnesota in the summer of 1853 with Clara and Wilhelm, who was 10 years old and furious about the move in the absolute and temporary way of 10-year-olds, which meant he was over it before they crossed into the territory. Clara had been glad to go. She had wanted land of their own more than the 30 acres of his father's Lancaster County property, more than what that crowded and expensive county offered a man without inherited wealth. Minnesota was vast and cheap and full of the specific promise of land that no one had yet exhausted, and Clara had seen it clearly the way she saw most things, with a directness of vision that Hans had loved and depended on and had never been able to develop in himself. His vision was deep rather than wide-focused, rather than panoramic. He saw one thing at a time and saw it with absolute completeness. Clara had seen everything at once. Together they had comprised something he couldn't entirely reconstruct without her. She died in the spring of 1854, 14 months after they arrived of a fever that moved through the territory with the efficiency of something that has never been told it isn't allowed. Hans buried her in the southeast corner of their rented land under a granite fieldstone he had spent 2 days leveling and setting with the same precision he brought to structural work because he didn't know how else to do it, because the only language he had for care was craftsmanship. Wilhelm was 11 years old. They had not talked about it much. They talked about it the way a man talks about a tool that's broken, with acknowledgement and without extending, because the work continued regardless. And the work was the only thing that kept either of them moving. It had taken 2 more years for Hans to accumulate enough from farm labor and occasional construction contracts to file a claim on 160 acres of his own. He filed in July of 1856. He was behind by every measure his neighbors would have recognized. The accepted practice was to build your cabin first, fast, functional shelter, before anything else, then your barn, then your fences, then your well, then improvement over years. Hans had no intention of following that sequence. He walked his 160 acres 3 times before he broke ground, each circuit producing new information about the terrain's slight variations, the prevailing wind's direction, and forced the placement of the sun in winter relative to the ridge to the south. On the second walk, he identified the granite outcrop at the northwest edge of the property. On the third walk, he brought the notebook and made measurements. The stone was good, hard, and consistent, the kind that wouldn't shale or crack under long-term structural load. He noted in the notebook, full quarry op 6 weeks, adjust for ox capacity, do not rush the corners. The final quarry and haul operation took 11 weeks. He had been off by 5. He absorbed the discrepancy without revision of the overall plan, which is what you do when the overall plan is correct, even if the timeline is optimistic. He broke ground in August. Elias Strand was the first neighbor to stop and watch. Elias was 42 years old, broad in the chest and certain in his bearing. Norwegian-American in the 4th generation, the kind of man whose confidence rested on genuine competence, and who had therefore never been forced to examine where one ended and the other began. He had survived 4 Minnesota winters through preparation and capability and a particular stubbornness about admitting cold, and that survival had given him an authority in the community's practical matters that nobody had formally granted him, but everybody recognized. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had made survival his primary credential and who had therefore decided that methods other than his were automatically suspect. He pulled his gray mare up at the property line on a Tuesday morning when the foundation walls had reached 7 feet and Hans was working the north corner alone, the ox cart loaded with the morning's granite haul. He looked at the walls, their height, their thickness, the obvious scale of the enclosed space they were creating. Then he looked at Hans. Henry. The full name, not the shortening, a small assertion of hierarchy, whether conscious or not. You've been at this foundation 8 weeks, and you're still not finished. Hans measured the stone in his hands against the gap he was filling, checking angle and fit before he committed mortar. 9 weeks now. Every other man on this road had his cabin standing in 3. You've got a foundation that would suit a mill building and nothing above it. A pause. This winter's not going to hold for your construction schedule. Hans set the stone, checked his level, tapped the left edge twice with his maul, and checked the level again. Different kind of foundation. Elias looked at the walls again with the narrowed assessment of someone recalculating. The width of the walls 18 inches, which was extraordinary, which was the kind of thickness you put under a building you planned to stand for 100 years and the height already achieved, and the interior space that was clearly being designed as a functional enclosure rather than a simple basement. You're going to put livestock in there? Yes. Right below where your family's going to sleep and eat? Yes. The silence that followed was the kind men use when they have made a decision but are still composing the justification. That's not how we do things here, Henry. You separate your living from your livestock. That's basic sanitation. That's what separates a proper homestead from a dugout. He let that sit for a moment, then added, I lost a horse in the winter of '53 because I hadn't built my barn solid enough. Built it right the following spring, separate from the house. Built it the way it's supposed to be built. Haven't had a problem since. That's the method. Hans picked up the next stone. Elias waited for a response that didn't arrive. He waited long enough that the waiting became its own statement, and then he turned his horse and rode back toward his own property, well-ordered and properly arranged cabin. Here barn there, the accepted spatial grammar of a right-thinking settler, and didn't look back. Robert Finch stopped once in late August on his way to town for supplies. He was 35, Ohio-born, a man of genuine good nature who navigated his life by careful observation of how others navigated theirs and then doing broadly similar things. He climbed down from his wagon and looked at the foundation with the honest interest of a man who doesn't understand something and wants to without pretending he already does. That's an extraordinary amount of stone hands. It is. 2-level structure, livestock below, family above. Yes. Robert tilted his head, doing the rough arithmetic of heat and stone and body warmth, getting close to the right answer without quite arriving at it. I've heard of something like this. Back east somewhere, Pennsylvania maybe. Pennsylvania, Hans said it simply without elaboration. Robert got back in his wagon. He was the kind of man who says one genuinely good thing before he leaves the kind of thing that costs him nothing but lands with unexpected weight. Well, if anyone's going to make it work. He clicked his horses forward and rolled toward town. What neither Robert nor Elias knew was that the most consequential opposition had already been set in motion by someone who had never raised her voice about it. Margaret Caldwell had ridden past Hans's property 6 times before she spoke to anyone about it, and when she spoke, she chose her words and her audience with the precision of someone who understands that how you frame a concern determines whether it becomes actionable or merely personal. She was 44 years old, born in New Haven, Connecticut, the daughter of a man who had taught at Yale, and the granddaughter of a shipbuilder who had understood structural load in ways that most people never needed to. She had come west in 1847 with her husband James, who had died in 1852, and left her with 400 acres of functioning sawmill, a staff of 6, and a grief she had resolved by incorporating it into the daily arithmetic of management. The grief was still there. It had just become load-bearing, like everything else. She was the most organized person in the county, and almost certainly the wealthiest, and she ran her operation with a methodical competence that earned her the respect of everyone who did business with her and the comfortable distance of everyone who lived near her. Because competence in a woman of her era and situation read to most people as coldness. She was not cold, Lynn. She was precise, which is different, though the difference requires patience to observe. She had noticed Hans Brouwer in August because he was a disruption to the established order of her morning rides, which was how she noticed most things as alterations in what had previously been predictable. She had initially categorized him as an eccentric newcomer who would either finish his unconventional project or abandon it, and either outcome would resolve her interest. But the foundation kept growing, and the walls kept thickening, and the quality of the stonework, which she could evaluate because her sawmill required masonry, and she had contracted enough of it to know what competent work looked like, was exceptional, which meant the man was not a fool, which meant the project was not going to abandon itself. What concerned her was not the practice itself. She had read enough in her father's library to know that two-level livestock and family structures had a legitimate history in the older parts of the country, had worked in Pennsylvania and in parts of the Northeast through many difficult winters. What concerned her was what it meant for the community's sense of its own standards. She had spent 5 years building this community's understanding of what a proper homestead looked like, what civilized people did and didn't put next to each other, what values separated a frontier settlement from an improvised camp. Those standards were fragile. They required consistent reinforcement. One prominent exception could unravel more than it seemed to the way one loose thread can take an entire seam with it if you pull it at the wrong angle. She stopped her horse at the property line on a late September morning with her property manager Earl beside her on his roan, and she looked at the foundation walls and then at the man building them, and she made her evaluation. "How many head does he plan to put in there?" she asked. Earl had done the arithmetic, already knowing she'd ask. 10 from what I hear, mix of cattle and horses. She looked at the ventilation gaps in the east wall, the deliberately designed apertures that were clearly not an oversight but a considered feature. The detail bothered her more than the overall concept because deliberate details meant a plan that went deeper than improvisation, a plan that would be harder to argue against on the grounds of foolishness or ignorance. You can dismiss a man who doesn't know what he's doing. Dismissing a man who clearly does requires a different argument. She rode back to her property and that same afternoon had a measured and carefully worded conversation with Franklin Howe about habitability standards for structures in the county. She framed it as a community health concern. She kept her personal opinion out of the language entirely. Howe listened as he always did and noted the concern as he always did and was unable to promise action as he always was, but said he could arrange for a review of the property if conditions warranted such review. There was another family Margaret had been watching through that same September, the Olsons, a couple who had arrived late from Ohio with 3 children and barely enough timber and resources to get a basic structure up before the cold came. She had extended them a line of credit at the Mill Practical Charity, dressed as commerce, and watching their hurried, inadequate construction going up 2 miles north of Prairie Road had reinforced her belief that standards mattered, that proper methods protected people. This belief sat alongside her opposition to Hans's methods in a way she had not yet examined for contradiction. Hans found out about the Territory Office inquiry 3 days later. Not from Howe and not from Margaret, but from the blacksmith in town who mentioned the Territorial Standards Office in passing, the way you mention something you assume the other person already knows. Hans absorbed the information with no visible alteration of his expression. That evening, he opened the notebook to the page with his construction timeline and wrote below the November 1st target date, underlined twice, no delays, no exceptions. He began working on Sundays after that. Wilhelm found out about the schoolyard situation from Thomas Larkin on Wednesday and about the Margaret situation on Thursday from Grace Finch's older son, who had overheard something at the general store, and the compounding of the 2 pieces of information produced in him a fury with no available exit. He was old enough to understand the full context, old enough to know about the notebook and what it represented, old enough to have absorbed enough of his father's knowledge to recognize that the house barn concept had a serious and proven history behind it, old enough to understand that the mockery was ignorance rather than judgment. Understanding this did not reduce the fury. It redirected it, which is worse because redirected fury looks for somewhere to land, and the nearest available target was the man who had caused the situation by building something that needed explaining. He confronted Hans on a Friday evening in the unfinished livestock enclosure standing on the stone floor, while his father checked the final ventilation gap in the east wall. The space already had a quality to it, even empty, even unfinished. The stone absorbed the remnants of the October sun and held it with a denseness that was different from the thin warmth of a wood-heated room, steadier, more fundamental, the warmth of mass rather than the warmth of combustion. Why didn't you just build a normal cabin? The flatness in Wilhelm's voice was Clara's recognizable and involuntary, the directness that surfaced in him when he was too tired to maintain the approximation of patience. We could have been done in June. We could have had a place that looks like everyone else's place. We could just live here without people stopping on the road to stare. Hans checked the second ventilation gap, inserted his hand to feel the draft pattern, withdrew it, made a note in the notebook without looking up. Father. The single word landed with more weight than Wilhelm had intended. Hans turned and looked at his son, the full, direct, unoccupied attention that work consumed before the boy could usually claim it, and Wilhelm held the eye contact with the difficulty of someone who has asked for something and is suddenly unsure about receiving it. You're building this for us. The certainty had gone out of Wilhelm's voice, replaced by something younger and less composed. But I don't see you in it. I see you working on it every hour I can remember. I just don't actually see you here. Hans was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that is not avoidance, but is instead the genuine processing of a man who has never learned to do that work out loud, who was raised by people who showed love through correct construction and precise effort rather than express sentiment, who had had a translator for that silence for 14 years and had been without her for 3. He stood in the stone enclosure his grandfather's knowledge had taught him to build, and his own hands had executed, and he looked at his son, and he took his time. Come Saturday, he said finally, I'll show you what your grandfather drew. Wilhelm went to bed still angry, but it was the anger that has been given something to move toward, which is a different thing than the anger that has nowhere to go. And he recognized the difference even at 13, which meant Clara had done something right in the years she'd had. Saturday afternoon at the wooden crate that served as their table, Hans opened the notebook and set it between them. The drawings were meticulous, cross-sectional diagrams of air movement through a 2-level structure, arrows indicating heat rise margin, annotations about the relationship between livestock respiration and humidity in the living space, above temperature columns tracking specific winter nights over 30 years of observation. His grandfather's handwriting was confident and unhurried throughout the script of a man documenting results rather than proposing theories. Wilhelm looked at the drawings without speaking for a long time, in the concentrated silence that Hans recognized as Clara's habit of taking things seriously. Grandfather built the same thing. First one in Lancaster County, 1815. Hans turned a page to the temperature record. His father told him it was foolish. His neighbors told him it was unhealthy. He let the page speak for itself, the column of winter temperatures and firewood numbers, the consistent results over decade after decade. That house stood 40 years. Your grandfather raised your father in it. I grew up visiting in January. The floors were warm every January. What happened to it? Sold when your grandfather died. New owner built something more fashionable. A pause that held more than it said. Cold winter the year they moved in. Wilhelm turned another page, then looked up. He wrote in English. Your grandfather was born in Pennsylvania, same county as me. Same as you, near enough. Hans closed the notebook and returned it to his breast pocket. We're Americans, same as anyone else on this road. We just remember something they forgot. The barn raising, though no one called it that because no single word in the local vocabulary covered what was being built, happened in the second week of October, when the log structure that would form the living quarters was ready to go up on top of the completed stone foundation. Hans had organized the invite through the informal network of Sunday church exchanges and midweek road conversation, and what came back was attendance. A dozen families from the surrounding roads. That was more about curiosity than community spirit. Though community spirit was the language everyone used to describe it, because it was more comfortable than admitting you were there to watch something you couldn't quite categorize. Elias was there with Clara and their 4 children. Robert was there with Grace. The Hendersons came, the Macaulays, the Pattersons, and the Olsen family from the North Road. Anders and Marta Olsen, who had arrived too late in the season to build adequately, and were watching the proceedings with the particular attention of people who are making mental notes for their own future decisions. The women set up food at trestle tables along the east fence, and the men organized themselves into the work with the loose efficiency of people who know how to raise a structure but aren't familiar with this particular structure's design intentions. Hans directed the work without wasting language. Each stage had been planned to the point where his instructions were brief and specific: this beam here, this notch, this way, these spacing intervals exactly as marked. The work moved faster than most of the helpers expected, which produced the mild frustration of men who had come prepared to be useful for longer. By midday, the log walls were up. By late afternoon, the roof structure was framing out. Margaret Caldwell did not come to the barn raising, but she rode past at 10 in the morning and again at 3 in the afternoon, both times at a walk slow enough to observe without being obvious about observing. On the second pass, the structure was clearly taking its final shape, the low-profile cabin sitting atop its stone foundation. With the deliberate proportions Hans had planned, the eaves projecting further than standard, the window openings small and strategic rather than generous and decorative. It looked like a man who had made specific decisions about every feature rather than a man who had built what came to hand. She rode past without stopping. Earl, riding behind her, understood from the set of her shoulders that the evaluation was ongoing. Wilhelm spent the raising on the scaffolding, passing timber and watching the crowd below with the particular attention of a boy processing two different realities simultaneously. He heard the woman named Henderson say, in a voice that carried the way whispers sometimes do when they aren't really whispers, living above animals, "I just can't imagine what that household is going to be like. What kind of woman keeps a house above a cattle barn?" He filed this in the same inventory as Thomas Larkin's schoolyard question, not with immediate response, because he had learned from his father that immediate response was not always the right kind, but with the patience of someone who understands that some answers require construction rather than argument. Anders Olsen stayed after the others had left, helping Hans straighten the last of the timber, bracing in the fading light. He was a quiet man, practical in the way of someone who has learned practicality through recent failure rather than long success. Before he hitched his wagon, he stood for a moment looking at the completed structure, the stone rising to the cabin above, with the expression of a man making a calculation. He didn't say anything to Hans about what the calculation produced, but he carried it home with him. By the 14th of October, the cabin was roofed and the livestock were moved in. Hans walked all 10 animals down the exterior ramp himself, one at a time, into the stone enclosure with its clean straw bedding and its carefully calculated ventilation. The procedure drew the neighbors the way unusual procedures always draw them. Elias from the road, Robert from the fence line, a few others pulled from passing by the visible departure from normal practice. Nobody said much. The mockery that had been comfortable when the foundation was abstract became less comfortable when the foundation was real and functioning and being put to its stated use. Elias watched in silence, which was not his characteristic mode, and the silence said more than his previous comments had. Margaret was at the property's eastern edge on her gray horse, at the angle that gave her the clearest view of the ramp and the enclosure entrance. She watched Hans close the pine door on the last animal, watched him check the bar and test the fit of the door frame, the small extra steps of a craftsman, making sure before he moves on, and watched him walk toward the exterior staircase without looking toward the road, without looking toward her, without offering the satisfaction of acknowledgement. She turned her horse. This time she didn't look back. That evening, the temperature dropped to 22 degrees, the sharpest drop of the fall, and Hans came back down after supper to check on the animals and note the temperature inside the enclosure. The straw was clean, and the animals were settled, and the stone walls held the warmth of 10 large bodies, the way stone holds everything slowly, completely, without giving it back easily. The reading at the center of the enclosure was 44 degrees, 16 degrees above the outdoor air, and the night had barely started. He climbed back up to the cabin and knelt on the pine floor and held his palm flat against the boards for a count of 30. 52 degrees at the floor, outdoor temperature 22, differential of 30 degrees, and the system was barely running the stone, not yet fully charged, the animals not yet in their full winter routine. He sat at the crate and opened the notebook to a clean page. He wrote the date. He wrote the temperatures. He wrote the differential. He wrote structure performing within expected parameters. System not yet at full thermal capacity. Expect improvement over next 30 days as stone reaches saturation. He held his pencil over the page for a moment. Through the west window across the dark prairie, he could see the orange glow of Elias Strand's cabin fire, generous invisible, the kind of fire you build when you have wood to spare and cold to fight. He looked at his own cooking stove, which had burned exactly half a cord since September and was doing its modest necessary work without drama. He wrote one more line below the technical notation in the plain voice he used when he wasn't writing for the record, but for something else, something that would outlast the record. I hope the boy will understand someday what this was built for. He closed the notebook. He put it in his breast pocket. He checked that the cabin door was properly gapped at the threshold for the ventilation flow, and then he banked the stove down to its minimum and walked to the corner where Wilhelm was already asleep under two quilts, one arm out, face slack and younger looking than it ever was when he was awake. Outside, the temperature was still dropping. The first hard season of the worst winter in Minnesota's recorded history was finding its depth, tightening its grip, preparing its argument. The prairie stretched flat and cold in every direction, white at the edges where the frost had settled, dark at the center where it hadn't yet. And somewhere to the north, still invisible, the real winter was organizing itself, calculating its approach, building towards something that would, in 3 months' time, make every decision made in the previous 3 months look either like wisdom or like catastrophe, with very little room between the two. Hans had built as if he already knew which one his was. He just had to wait for the season to say so. November arrived the way experienced settlers expected it to arrive, without apology and without gradation, skipping the temperate middle ground that October had occasionally offered and moving directly into the cold that was the territory's honest default setting. The prairie grass went from silver to gray to brown to buried in the space of 10 days, and the sky compressed itself to a particular shade of pewter that the Minnesotans recognized as the ceiling of a room that would not be opened again until April. And the smoke from every chimney on Prairie Road climbed straight up in the windless mornings and bent hard south in the afternoons when the wind came down from Canada without friction or hesitation across the flat, nothing between there and here. Hans tracked the season the way he tracked everything in the notebook, in numbers, with observations that would be useful to the person who read them later. November 3rd, first measurable snowfall, 4 inches, temperature dropped to 12 overnight. Enclosure holding at 41 degrees at midnight, cabin floor. 49 degrees, November 10th, second. Snowfall 7 inches, wind northwest, temperature at the floor 52 degrees, outside, temperature 8. November 17th, overnight, low 4 degrees above zero, enclosure temperature 43, living space 61 at midday. The differential was holding. The stone was doing what stone does when you give it enough mass and time, storing what was offered to it during the warmer daylight hours, releasing it in the dark, with the patient consistency of something that has no opinion about the process, that simply obeys the physics. He burned wood twice a day, morning and evening, for cooking. On particularly sharp nights, he added a second log to the small heating stove at bedtime, not because the cabin required it, but because he was a man who understood the difference between adequate and comfortable and saw no virtue in denying the distinction. His total consumption through November tracked at roughly 3/4 of a cord, which put him on pace to finish the season with a cord to spare, but from his 5-cord reserve, a cord of headroom that was not luxury but calculation, because any plan built without margin was a plan built without honesty about uncertainty. Elias Strand burned through 2 cords in November alone. Hans didn't know this by direct observation. He knew it the way people in close-quartered rural communities know things, through the blacksmith, through the feed store, through the accumulative information of how much wood-splitting sound carried across the prairie on still mornings and what it implied about rate of consumption. By the second week of November, the rhythm of Elias's axe was already operating at the pace of a man behind schedule, rather than a man working ahead of need. Clara Strand had been seen at the supply store in town twice in a single week, both times with the specific purpose of purchasing additional lamp oil and candling tallow, which suggested a household burning through consumables at a higher rate than anticipated, which suggested a household where the cold was winning more hours of the day than the heat was. Robert Finch's situation was harder to calculate because his cabin was smaller and therefore required less wood to achieve a given temperature, though it also lost that temperature faster when the fire dropped, being lighter in construction with thinner walls and a foundation that extended only 2 courses of fieldstone above the frost line. Robert was conscientious and careful and not running short, but he was running without margin. the way a careful man runs when he's built to an average winter, rather than a hard one, which is what most careful men build to, because the alternative requires a pessimism about the future that is difficult to sustain through the optimism of arrival and beginning. Margaret Caldwell's situation was the most opaque to Hans and the most misleading to any outside observer. She had the resources to buy all the firewood the county could supply her. Her household consumed at a high rate the main house, the sawmill's attached office, the bunkhouse where her hands slept, but consumption without constraint is a different kind of vulnerability than consumption outrunning supply, because it means you never develop the instinct to conserve, never learn where the actual floor of requirement is, never understand what your structure can and can't hold against the kind of cold that doesn't negotiate with money. Margaret's money kept her warm. That was not the same as her house keeping her warm, and the difference would matter more than she currently knew. The Olsons on the North Road were in a simpler and more immediately precarious position. A single-story cabin with a fieldstone foundation, 3 courses high, walls of green timber that hadn't had the season to cure properly, a stove that was adequate for a settled structure and inadequate for one still exhaling moisture through its own walls. Anders had built the best he could in the time available. Marta had set up the household with the competence of someone making functional order out of imperfect material. Their 3 children slept in the main room from the first week of November, and the family was burning through their supply at a rate that would leave them short before February, unless the winter was mild, which nothing about November suggested it would be. Wilhelm had been inside Margaret Caldwell's sawmill twice before he went a third time alone. The first 2 times had been with Hans, purchasing dimensional lumber for the cabin's interior partition, and then returning a week later for additional board footage when the measurements on the north wall turned out to require more coverage than the original calculation. Margaret had been present both times, conducting business at the counter in the manner of a woman who considers the counter a position rather than a convenience, upright, precise, economical in her transactions, without being unfriendly, treating Hans with the particular professional courtesy that covers more complex feelings the way a coat covers complicated clothing. Hans had purchased what he needed and departed without extending the transaction, which Margaret appeared to appreciate in the way she appeared to appreciate most things silently, with minimal indication that appreciation was occurring. The third visit was Wilhelm's alone on a gray Tuesday in early December, on the pretext of purchasing 2 penny nails he didn't strictly need before the weekend. The real reason was less articulable and involved a 13-year-old boy's inarticulate need to put himself in the vicinity of the situation that was causing him the most ambient discomfort, as though proximity to the source might offer some form of resolution that distance hadn't. Margaret was at the counter with her account ledger when he came in. She looked up and made the identification with the quick efficiency of someone whose memory for faces is a professional tool. She returned to the ledger, made a notation, closed it, and looked at him again with the full considered attention she apparently brought to all transactions, regardless of their scale. "What do you need?" Wilhelm named the nails. She retrieved them from the shelf behind her without checking whether she had them, which meant she knew her inventory without consulting it, which was the kind of competence that had the same quality as his father's, built from repetition and genuine interest rather than performance. He paid and had the nails in his coat pocket and was at the door when she spoke again, without looking up from the new column she was opening in the ledger. "Your father actually believes that structure is going to carry his family through a Minnesota winter, or is he just too stubborn to change course now that he's put the work in?" She said it without inflection that would clearly identify it as hostile or genuinely curious, which meant it could be either, which meant the answer mattered more than the question indicated. Wilhelm's hand was on the door handle. He stood still for a moment with his back partly to her, the way his father stood still when he was measuring something before he committed to it. Then he turned enough to meet her eye across the counter. "My father doesn't do things he doesn't believe in. He doesn't know how." She looked at him over the ledger with an expression that was not dismissal and not approval, and was doing something more careful than either. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to determine that he meant it not as defense but as statement of observed fact. Then she returned to the ledger. Wilhelm walked back to the homestead in the cold afternoon light with the nails he didn't need and a feeling he couldn't name, the feeling of having said something true in a place where truth wasn't the expected currency, and having had it received as such by someone whose opinion he hadn't known he cared about until he found out he did. He didn't tell Hans about the conversation. December deepened with the particular relentlessness of a Minnesota winter that has made up its mind. The temperature on the 14th dropped to -8 overnight and held there until noon, which was a new floor for the season, and one that extracted a corresponding cost from every household's fuel reserve. Elias had burned through the first 10 cords, half his total supply, before December was a week old. He knew this. He had stacked and counted in October, with the confident arithmetic of a man who has done the calculation before and arrived at adequate, and he was watching the stack shrink at a rate that made the original calculation look like it had been built on more generous assumptions than Minnesota was currently prepared to honor. He didn't mention this to Clara. He didn't mention it to anyone because a man who had spent months telling his neighbors that Hans's methods were foolishness was not in a position to announce that his own methods were failing to keep pace with the season. Clara mentioned it to Grace Finch on a Sunday after church services in the oblique but legible way that women mention things they cannot say directly because saying them directly would make them real in a way that sideways reference manages to avoid. Her hands were cracked and bleeding at the knuckles from the daily wood handling. She demonstrated this incidentally by adjusting her glove, not as complaint, but as information. And she mentioned that Elias had been waking twice a night to stoke the stove rather than once, and that the children were sleeping in the main room now because the bedroom corner was running 10 degrees colder than the stove side. Grace listened with the careful neutrality of a good friend who understands that the appropriate response is reception rather than advice. Grace went home that afternoon and told Robert what she'd heard. Robert went to his wood stack the following morning and counted the remaining cords and sat for a while on the chopping block looking at the number. He was not running short, but he was running at a rate that assumed the worst of the winter was behind them rather than ahead, and if the worst was ahead, the number on the chopping block needed to be larger. He spent the afternoon splitting the last of the green wood he'd been drying since August, adding a quarter cord to the total he could rely on and trying to remember whether he'd ever heard of a Minnesota winter that peaked before January. He couldn't remember one. On Christmas Day, 1856, the temperature dropped to 22 degrees below zero. It dropped there at sundown and held through the night and was still there at 8 in the morning. When Hans came in from the enclosure with the temperature reading, the livestock quarters had held at 41 degrees, which was a narrower margin than usual, but within the expected range for the exterior conditions. The cabin floor stood at 54 degrees when he knelt to measure it, which was lower than the daily average, but representative of the system's overnight behavior, the stone releasing its stored heat through the long, cold dark at a rate that maintained habitability without requiring intervention. He had not fed the stove after 11 the previous night. He had added nothing between 11 and 8. The cabin had lost 9 degrees in 9 hours, which was a degree per hour, which was the arithmetic of a building that was holding rather than surrendering. He ate breakfast with Wilhelm at the crate and watched the weather through the west window in the early morning light. The sky was the hard blue of extreme cold, cloudless and absolute. The kind of sky that is beautiful in the way that certain dangerous things are beautiful clearly and without equivocation. Smoke from Elias's chimney was visible 2 miles distant, a column that rose and then bent sharply south in the upper wind, and the density and color of it indicated a fire burning at maximum rather than minimum, a fire that was working at its capacity limit rather than maintaining a reserve. Hans looked at that smoke for a long moment. It was not satisfaction in what he saw. It was closer to the feeling of a man watching weather he warned people about. Arrive on schedule, a feeling that is part vindication and part grief, because the vindication only means something good for yourself, and the grief is because it means something difficult for someone else, and both of these are true simultaneously, and neither one cancels the other. Wilhelm was looking at the same smoke. They're burning a lot. Yes. Does he know Elias? Does he understand what's happening? The question was not rhetorical. It was a genuine inquiry from a boy trying to model someone else's comprehension of their own situation. Hans poured more coffee. He knows how much wood he has. He knows how fast it's going. He's a practical man. He put the pot back on the stove. Whether he knows those two facts at the same time is different. That evening, Margaret Caldwell sat alone in her study with the accounts and the Christmas candle and the sounds of her household, the housekeeper in the kitchen. The hands in the bunkhouse across the yard filling the spaces that furniture alone couldn't fill in a house built for more than one person, and now occupied by essentially one. She had made money in 1856 more than in any previous year. The sawmill had operated at capacity for 8 of the 12 months. She had extended her east pasture fence by a quarter mile, added a fourth horse to her stable, replaced the bunkhouse roof before the season changed. Every column in the ledger told the story of a property being well managed and a woman equal to its demands. She put the account book down on the desk and looked at the Christmas candle for a long time. The question that arrived in the silence, arriving with the casual devastation of questions that had been waiting for an unguarded moment, was not about the accounts and not about the property. It was a simpler and more corrosive question, the kind that tends to appear in the quiet of competence once the noise of accomplishment settles for whom. She did not answer it. She closed the ledger, put out the candle, and went to bed early, which was as close as Margaret Caldwell ever came to admitting she didn't know what to do next. The first week of January moved at the pace of a season settling into its full character. The cold became less event and more atmosphere, less something that happened and more simply the condition of everything, the background against which all other conditions operated. Elias was seen at the woodpile at hours that suggested the domestic schedule had reorganized itself entirely around the demands of the fire, which was no longer a convenience but a negotiation. Everything else in the household fitted to the fire's requirements rather than the other way around. Robert climbed his roof on the 8th to clear creosote from the chimney, a procedure requiring him to spend 40 minutes at elevation in a temperature of -12 with a wind that made it feel like -25. And he came down with his hands so cold that Grace had to help him get his gloves off, and the hands underneath were white in the specific way that requires 20 minutes near heat before feeling returns and an accounting of whether all the feeling that returns is the same as what left. On a Thursday morning in the second week of January, Hans's message from the schoolmaster arrived via the Finch boy, who delivered it with the embarrassed gravity of a child carrying bad news. He doesn't fully understand Wilhelm had not been in school. The teacher wanted to ensure the boy was not ill. He was not ill. Hans found him in the livestock enclosure in the northwest corner, where the body heat from the animals moved in gentle circulation through the space and the temperature held at 42. Even in the morning cold, sitting cross-legged on the clean straw, with the notebook open on his knees and a look of concentrated absorption that Hans recognized from a dozen Lancaster County memories. His own father reading the same notebook, his uncle tracing the same diagrams with a work-rough finger. Wilhelm looked up when Hans came through the door. He didn't offer apology or explanation. He held up the notebook instead, open to the temperature record page, the columns of observations his grandfather had made over 30 winters, the consistent arithmetic of a system proving itself year after year. "I can read all of it." He said it with a directness that was not defiance. "Every word." Grandfather wrote in plain English, clear as anything I've read in school. He turned a page. "He writes here that the coldest night he ever recorded was 17 below in 1831. Says the enclosure floor temperature never dropped below 38. Says the family living space never dropped below 50. He closed the notebook carefully and held it out to Hans. "That's not a record he wrote down hoping people would believe him someday. That's a man writing things down because he needed to remember them himself." Hans sat down on the straw beside his son. It was not a thing he planned. His body made the decision before his mind confirmed it, the way the body sometimes knows what's needed before the mind has finished deliberating. He sat with his back against the stone, and the 10 animals steady and unhurried around them, and the cold locked outside the 18-inch walls, and he looked at the son who had his mother's directness and his grandfather's patience, and whatever was specifically his own that had not yet fully declared itself. "Grandfather never went to school past 14, Hans offered. Left at 14 to help on the farm. Couldn't afford to stay." He picked up a clean piece of straw and turned it in his fingers, the unconscious fidgeting of a man who is more comfortable with objects than silences. Built 3 structures in his life, all of them still standing when he died. Built the first one without a single person in the county who'd seen one done the same way. Built it because his father described it, and he could hold the description in his head and turn it into stone and timber. He set the straw down. That house kept your father's family alive through winters I can't describe to you without you thinking I'm exaggerating. Wilhelm was quiet in the way of a person receiving something rather than preparing a response. Then why didn't you ever just tell people that? Tell Elias, tell Mrs. Caldwell, tell the whole county, here's what this is and here's why. Hans was quiet for a moment that had the quality of a thing considered rather than avoided. Because there are two kinds of knowing. There's knowing that something is true, and there's knowing it in your body, in your feet, in January, in your hands that didn't have to split wood at 3 in the morning. He stood up from the straw and brushed his coat. I can tell a man the second kind is coming. Can't give it to him. He has to get there himself. And they walked up to the cabin together, and Hans made coffee, and they sat across from each other, with the warmth from the floor moving up through the boards in the quiet way it always moved. And between them on the crate was the notebook that 3 generations of men had used to record the results of a single persistent conviction about the relationship between stone and heat and care. The 22nd of January arrived with the particular sky that people who have experienced only 1 or 2 previous hard winters don't yet know how to read. Hans had been watching it since the afternoon of the 21st, the cloud formation to the northwest moving faster than the surface wind would explain, carrying a pressure differential that was visible in the way the horses in the enclosure had been restless for the past 18 hours. The way the barn door rattled at intervals that didn't correlate to any visible wind, the way the temperature had dropped 3 degrees in the hour after sundown rather than the usual one. He had seen something like this sky once before in the winter of 1848, when he was still in Lancaster County, and a storm came through that killed 4 horses and 2 elderly residents, and rearranged the county's understanding of what a bad winter actually meant. He brought in 2 additional buckets of water from the well and stored them near the stove. He checked the livestock enclosure door bar twice and added a second layer of straw bedding to the north side where the animals clustered in cold weather. He inventoried the cooking stores and confirmed 3 weeks of provisions without resupply. He checked every gap in the cabin's chinking and found 2 that needed immediate attention, which he addressed with mortar and a flat tool in the hour before full dark, working by lantern in the cold that was already dropping, with the deliberate intention of something that has decided on a destination and is moving toward it at its own pace. He told Wilhelm at supper, "Stay inside tomorrow. Not out to the well, not out to the woodpile, not out for any reason until I say so." Wilhelm had been watching his father's preparations with the literacy of a boy who had been paying attention. He nodded without asking for elaboration. The storm arrived at 2 in the morning on the 23rd. It arrived not gradually but completely. One moment the night was cold and still, and the next moment the wind was operating at a register that moved from sound into physical presence, a force that pressed against the log walls with steady insistence and found the cabin's small imperfections and tested them with the patient thoroughness of a structural examiner who has all the time in the world. The temperature was already below -30 when Hans rose at 2:30 to check the enclosure, and by the time he crossed the 12 feet of protected exterior passage between the cabin door and the enclosure entrance, the wind had driven particles of ice into the seam between his collar and his neck that felt less like weather and more like a decision the night had made about him specifically. Inside the enclosure, the animals had moved to the center of the space, the natural clustering behavior of livestock under pressure, and the temperature at the enclosure's heart was 39 degrees, which was lower than the seasonal average, but structurally coherent. The stone walls were performing their function of retention, even as the exterior temperature dropped to levels that were forcing the differential to work harder than it had been tested. Hans checked each animal by hand and lantern, running his palm along flanks and checking ears and leg joints for the temperature indicators that tell you more than a reading does, and found them restless but sound. He climbed back up to the cabin and took the temperature at the floor 53 degrees on a night when the air outside was below -30. The margin was narrower than he would have preferred, but it was a margin. It held. Across the prairie, Elias Strand's chimney was burning, with an intensity visible through the horizontal-driven snow, an orange glow that the storm would normally have concealed but couldn't fully contain because of the heat being generated. He was burning at maximum capacity, which Hans knew meant he was burning his better seasoned wood first, the wood that caught clean and burned hot, which was the right decision in the short term, and a decision that moved the harder fuel on to later in the storm, when fatigue would make it harder to manage. The arithmetic of that sequence was not comfortable. The first full day of the storm passed with the relentless monotony of extreme weather wind that didn't vary, snow that drove horizontal rather than falling, temperature that held in the -30s and occasionally visited the -40s when the gusts compressed. Hans kept a log in the notebook. Enclosure temperature holding at 38 to 40. Cabin floor temperature 50 to 53. Wood consumption for day one of storm 1/2 cord. He read the previous day's temperature records and compared them to current readings, confirming the system was operating inside its expected parameters under conditions beyond what the original design had anticipated. Wilhelm read. He had 3 books from the school's lending shelf and a collection of the monthly farm reports that Hans had been accumulating, and he worked through them with the focused discipline of a boy who had found that occupation was the most effective management tool for anxiety. He checked the floor temperature himself twice with his palm, the gesture his father made automatic, and both times the warmth under his hand was the most concrete possible argument for the correctness of the decision that had been made and the effort that had been spent making it. On the afternoon of the second day, he heard it across the howling, through the storm's attempt to fill all available acoustic space, the sound of an axe. It was coming from the direction of Elias's property, which was 1/2 mile northeast. And the fact that it was audible at all through the storm's interference meant it was being swung with significant force and considerable desperation, because normal wood splitting doesn't carry 1/2 mile, and this one did. Wilhelm was at his coat before Hans looked up from the notebook. The stop was not physical. Hans didn't stand or reach. He spoke, and the quality of what was in his voice was something Wilhelm had never encountered there in exactly this configuration. Not the measured instruction of a man directing work, not the careful explanation of a man transmitting knowledge. Something older and less composed. Something that had been kept in a register where it didn't interfere with function and was now surfacing because the situation had created the pressure to surface it. You're not going out there. He's burning furniture. You can tell from the sound that's not log splitting. The cadence is wrong. The impact is wrong. Wilhelm. The name had weight in it, the weight of everything Hans had not said in 3 years. Everything he'd processed through work and notebook entries in mortar and stone rather than language. I have one person in this world who is absolutely mine to protect. One. And that person is not going outside into -40 with horizontal snow and wind that will take you off your feet and turn you around until you don't know which way the house is. His voice was level, but the level was maintained by effort, the way you hold a door closed against pressure by leaning your full weight against it. I understand what's happening to Elias's family. I will go to him when the storm allows. I am not going to lose you to help someone I can get to in the morning. Wilhelm stood with his coat half on and looked at his father, and what he saw was not the man who directed work and kept the notebook and built things correctly and moved through his life with the dense efficiency of purposeful stone. He saw the remainder of what was left after Clara, the man who had been carrying the weight of sole responsibility for a single irreplaceable person for 3 years and who had never put that weight down or named it or asked for assistance with it, who had built and calculated and recorded instead of speaking it. He took the coat off. He sat back down. They listened together to the sound of Elias's axe growing more erratic in the late afternoon as fatigue worked its reliable mathematics on the pace and quality of the effort, and neither of them spoke about what they were hearing because some things don't require commentary to be understood. Margaret Caldwell's 4 horses died on the second night of the storm. She had built her stable with the same competence she brought to the sawmill, and the main house good lumber, solid construction, functionally adequate under ordinary Minnesota winter conditions. What the stable lacked was thermal mass. Woodsheds heat the way wood burns completely and without negotiation. The walls of her stable were 2 inches of pine board plus a 1/2 inch of dried batting insulation, which was standard, which was what the county's carpenters recommended, which was insufficient for 3 consecutive nights, below -35, with wind loading that extracted heat from any surface. It touched faster than any internal source could replace it. Her house manager, Earl, came to her door at midnight on the 24th with the information in his face before he could form the words for it. He had done what he could. He and the 2 remaining hands had moved into the stable at 8 in the evening with every blanket available and a small iron stove they dragged in on a rope and they'd maintain the stove and wrap the animals individually and work continuously through the 10 coldest hours. It was not enough. The first horse was gone before midnight and the fourth before 3 in the morning. Margaret dressed and went out to the stable and stood in what was now an enclosure containing the results of the night's failure, and the cold in there had a specific quality that is different from the cold of an empty space. It was the cold of something that had been warm and was no longer the cold of absence, rather than the cold of never having been. And it was more complete than anything the outdoor temperature could have produced on its own. Earl stood with her in the stable and said nothing because there was nothing that would help. She had his professional loyalty and his genuine respect, and he offered both in the form of silent, continued presence while she processed what she was looking at. She had known, in the way you know things you don't examine directly, that the horses were the kind of asset that couldn't be replaced quickly. In the territory, it would take months to source comparable animals at reasonable prices. And the spring work season was 11 weeks away, and the spring work season without sufficient horsepower was a mathematical problem that cascaded through every other aspect of the property's operation. She stood in the cold stable and did the arithmetic she had been trained by her father and her husband and 5 years of soul management to do. And the arithmetic arrived at a number that was serious enough to require a plan, and a number for which she did not currently have one. The storm held its third day with the diminishing ferocity of something that has delivered its main message and is now repeating itself out of institutional inertia. The wind dropped from continuous to intermittent during the afternoon of the 25th, and by evening the horizontal snow had become vertical snow, which is not the same as good news but is a measurable improvement in the direction of it. Hans noted in the notebook storm abating, temperature -28, wind diminished. Floor temperature 55 degrees improved as exterior conditions moderated. Total wood consumption, storm period, 3 days 1 and 1/3 cords. Remaining supply, 3 1/2 cords plus buffer. The morning of the 26th arrived with the silence that follows major storms, which is a specific kind of silence rather than the absence of sound. It is the sound of a world in which all the prior sound-producing activity has been suspended and replaced by the vast uniform non-negotiable fact of snow. Everything that had been a landmark was either gone or reduced to a white shape that implied its former identity without confirming it. The temperature at sunrise was -28 with no wind, which was the kind of cold that is honest rather than theatrical, straightforward and complete, not trying to impress anyone, simply existing at the magnitude it existed at. Hans was dressed and at the cabin door by 7. Wilhelm was already awake, standing in the kitchen corner, already in his coat. Their eyes met across the cabin. "You'll stay close." Hans's voice had returned to its operational register, the voice he used when the decision was made and the action was next. "Arms reach when the snow is deep enough, that footing is uncertain. You fall, you call out immediately. No heroism about getting back up." "Understood." They went out together into the post-storm morning, and the cold hit them with the comprehensive immediacy of a temperature that is not interested in the adjustment period. The snow was waist-deep on Hans in the open stretches between the property lines lower, where wind had scoured it higher, where it had found obstacles to drift against, and they moved through it with the inefficient labor of men doing work that the landscape has decided should require maximum effort. Wilhelm was a half-step behind his father and a half-step to the right in the slight depression Hans's movement created in the snow, and he kept his eyes on the back of his father's coat with the single-pointed attention of someone who has been given one job and intends to do it correctly. They found Elias in the woodshed. He was standing at the chopping block with an axe in his hands, in the specific posture of a man who has been doing the same physical action for so long that the action has separated from intention and is operating on its own residual momentum, the way a wheel keeps spinning after the motive force has been removed. His remaining wood-green timber and partial boards, and what appeared to be the legs of a bed frame, was stacked against the back wall in a quantity that was at once more than nothing and substantially less than enough. His face had the hollowed, smoke-marked quality of 3 days without sleep and continuous work in the confined heat and cold alternation of a fire-managed winter crisis. He looked up when Hans came through the shed door, and his face went through several things in sequence: relief, calculation, and then the particular expression of a man confronting the gap between the position he has held and the position he is currently in. Clara and the children were inside alive, huddled in the configuration of survival, rather than the configuration of comfort in the cabin's interior. Was 33 degrees, which is above freezing, but not by the margin that children should experience for extended periods. Hans surveyed the wood supply and the man in the situation with the quick, complete assessment of someone who has been in physical emergencies and knows that evaluation must precede action and must be fast. He looked at Elias steadily. Bring your family to my house. Now. Your livestock too, whatever's still standing. Elias held the axe. He looked at it rather than at Hans for a moment that lasted long enough to contain everything it needed to contain: the months of mockery, the public predictions of failure, the private escalation of fear that he had carried alone through the storm, because admitting it would have required admitting what he'd said. The axe was the last posture of the position he'd held, and he was holding it past the point where holding it made any sense, and he knew it, and then he put it down. The children first, Elias said, his voice carrying the friction of 3 days of smoke and cold. Clara needs help with the little ones. They haven't eaten properly since the second morning. They moved the families by sled, Hans pulling Wilhelm, steadying from the side, Elias behind with Clara and the youngest wrapped in the remaining blankets. Robert Finch's cabin was on the way, and Robert met them at his door, looking like a man who had been waiting for someone to come and was relieved it had arrived before the alternative. Grace had the 2 children ready. Robert had kept his family alive and functional through the storm, through the careful management of a man who plans conservatively and executes consistently, but the margins had been close enough that he carried the look of someone who has been doing arithmetic about outcomes he didn't want to think about. They went past Margaret's property on the return route, and the situation there declared itself through Earl, who was at the stable door, with the flat, worked-through expression of someone who has already grieved what needs grieving and is now in the operational phase. He waved them over before they reached the main house. Margaret was in the study when Hans came through the front door, sitting at the desk where she conducted her accounts wearing her working clothes rather than her house dress, which meant she had been up through the night and had moved straight from emergency management into whatever came next without the pause that normal circumstances would have permitted. Her right hand was bandaged with strips of her own petticoat applied with reasonable competence, which meant she had dressed the wound herself, which meant she hadn't wanted to ask Earl for assistance, even for that. She looked up from the desk with the eyes of someone who has already put the grief in the compartment where things go when you can't process them yet, because the present requires full capacity. She looked at Hans and then at Wilhelm behind him and then back at Hans. 4 horses, she said. Her voice was functional reporting rather than lamenting. I made the wrong calculation about the stable. I built to standard, and the standard was wrong for what last night was. Hans stood in the doorway with the cold from the exterior still radiating off his coat. He looked at the bandaged hand. He looked at the expression that was managing more than expressions are designed to manage. He said, "My house is warm. Enough room for everyone who needs it tonight. Come." He said it the way he said most things, without decoration, without the scaffolding of social elaboration, simply the information and the offer placed where she could take it. Margaret sat with the question for exactly as long as a woman who has managed her own affairs for 5 years without needing anyone's house can sit with it. Then she stood up from the desk, took her coat from the hook by the door, and put it on. By the time the afternoon light had gone to gray and the temperature outside had settled to its post-storm resting place of -28, Hans's cabin held 3 families and 1 woman, who was not quite a family and was not quite not, and a fire in the cooking stove that was burning at modest, sufficient, unhurried capacity, and a floor that was doing exactly what it had been designed by a Lancaster County man in 1815 to do, and built by his grandson 61 years later in an explicit act of faith in the value of things that have been proven rather than merely proposed. Clara Strand came through the cabin door and stopped. She stood in the entrance with the cold still on her coat and her children pressing past her toward the warmth, and her husband standing behind her with the blank look of a man who has been running on reserves and has just encountered something his reserves didn't anticipate. She stood still and felt the heat meeting her from the floor rising up through boards that had been storing it for hours, and the feeling was so specifically counter to everything the last 3 days had been, that it broke through the management she'd been maintaining since the storm began, broke through quietly and completely, and she stood in the doorway and let it happen. Wilhelm was standing near the back wall watching the room fill. He looked at his father, who was adding the single log that would carry the cooking stove through the preparation of a meal for 11 people. And the look he got back was not triumph and not vindication and not the satisfaction of having been right when others were wrong. It was something more like the steady acknowledgement of a man who built something to do a job and is watching it do the job, which is its own quiet form of completion. The form that doesn't require anyone else's recognition because the work itself is the witness. The first morning after the storm had the quality of a held breath. 11 people arranged in 600 square feet of pine and stone, organizing themselves around the simple requirement of continued warmth with the pragmatic creativity of people who have temporarily set aside every social preference in favor of the more basic preference of not being cold. Clara Strand had the children settled near the south wall by the time Hans came up from the enclosure at 7:30 with the morning temperature reading, and Grace Finch had found the rhythm of the kitchen corner well enough to be managing the first meal before anyone formally discussed the division of domestic labor. Robert had taken the corner near the door with the quiet spatial intelligence of a man who understands that his family is a guest and behaves accordingly. Elias sat near the stove on the chair Hans had put beside it. Not the best chair, not the worst, the chair that communicated welcome without ceremony and held a cup of coffee with both hands and didn't speak. Margaret was at the table with her bandaged hand flat on the surface and her back straight and her eyes moving through the cabin with the systematic assessment of someone whose first response to any new environment is to understand it. She was not cataloging deficiencies. She was registering how things worked, the relationship between the stove's modest output and the temperature in the far corner. The quality of air that shouldn't have been this clean, in a space this occupied, the warmth rising steadily from the floor beneath her stockinged feet. She had slept 4 hours on a quilted pallet near the east wall and woken without the stiff cold that normally characterized her mornings even in her own well-appointed bedroom, because there was no cold creeping in from beneath to meet her on the way up. The warmth had come from below throughout the night, from stone that held what it was given, and the constancy of it was a different quality of comfort than anything a wood stove produced, less like a fire and more like a characteristic of the building itself. Hans set the notebook on the table and opened it to the morning's entry without sitting down. Enclosure temperature 42 degrees, floor temperature 56, outdoor temperature -24 and moderating. The numbers were for his own record, but he left the notebook open where it could be read, which was not an accident. Margaret looked at the columns. She read the way she read her own ledgers, not following the entries in sequence, but triangulating across them, looking for pattern and consistency and the places where the expected and the actual diverged. There were almost no such places. The system had run within its predicted parameters through conditions that had exceeded what any reasonable design would have anticipated, which meant the original design had been built with more margin than anyone who hadn't read the supporting documentation would have known to credit it with. She turned one page back without asking, looking at the November and December entries, running her eye down the differential columns. Hans let her read without comment. This was the plainest form of argument available. Not language, not demonstration, just results arranged in columns by a man whose grandfather had started the same columns 40 years before in Pennsylvania, and whose consistency of method across that span of time was itself a form of evidence. Elias came down to the enclosure with Hans after breakfast. He had not asked to come. He had simply followed at the appropriate distance, the way a man follows when he has decided to do something and has not yet decided how to ask permission, and Hans had not turned around or acknowledged the company until they were both standing inside the enclosure with the animals moving in their unhurried morning patterns around them. The temperature held at 42. The humidity of the space was different from the cabin above, richer, warmer in quality, carrying the biological warmth of 10 large mammals in a contained stone room. Not unpleasant, not what Elias had expected on the strength of his imagination. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the walls and at the animals and at the straw bedding and at the specific design of the ventilation gaps that Hans had cut at calculated intervals along the east wall. His 4 surviving cattle were in the south corner, thinner than Hans's animals, and more skittish, still carrying the biological residue of the storm's stress. Beside them, Hans's 10 stood in their routine postures, the postures of animals that had not spent 3 days in survival mode, And the difference between the two groups was the difference between a system that had been stretched and a system that had been held. Elias looked at his cattle for a long time. He reached out and ran his hand along the flank of the nearest one, his best milk cow, the one he'd driven up from Iowa with particular care in the spring of 1854, and felt the ribs beneath more prominently than they should have been. He didn't say anything. The hand on the animal's side was the acknowledgement, the way men who aren't comfortable with direct expression sometimes make contact with something else, to say the thing they can't say directly. Hans checked the straw in the northwest corner, which was due for replacement, and began pulling the old bedding out without ceremony. Elias picked up the fork that was propped against the east wall and started helping. They worked alongside each other in the 42-degree air, turning the bedding and pulling the soiled sections and replenishing from the stored bales in the south alcove, and the work organized itself between them with the natural efficiency of two people who both know what they're doing, even if they've never done it together before. Upstairs, Margaret was asking Grace about the water system, specifically how Hans managed the well access during the storm, because her own well had been inaccessible for 36 hours, and the stored water supply had run lower than she'd anticipated. Grace explained the interior storage practice, the additional barrels Hans maintained near the stove, the calculation of the minimum reserve required before a storm of any severity. Margaret listened and noted in the specific way she noted things without writing anything down because she didn't need to. Her memory for operational information was one of her reliable assets, the kind of precision that substituted for paper in the moment and produced it later when paper was appropriate. Clara found herself in the conversation by proximity, adding detail about how she tried to manage her own water supply and where the system had broken down. The two women were standing at Hans's kitchen counter with the children arranged in their various pursuits around the room, and the conversation had the quality of a practical exchange that was carrying something else alongside the practical content, the thing that women carry in their conversations when they've been through something together and that something has broken through whatever they were before. Clara's hands were healing, the cracked knuckles beginning to close with the absence of the wood splitting that had been cracking them daily for 3 months. She held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at what a kitchen managed differently looked like, and let herself absorb it without performing the feelings it produced. Robert spent the morning at the table with a stub of pencil and 3 sheets of brown paper that he'd found in Hans's paper supply, drawing with the focused application of a man who has decided that drawing is the most productive use of the time available to him. His sketches were functional rather than precise, a man who can see the shape of something and commit it to paper without formal training, and he worked from observation, looking at the floor structure, the eave proportions, the chimney position, the relationship between the foundation's visible top course and the cabin's first log. He was not drawing what the structure looked like. He was drawing what it did insofar as structure can be made to reveal function through a 2-dimensional image, which is imperfectly but not negligibly. Wilhelm watched Robert draw and then sat across from him and opened the notebook to the foundation diagrams. He placed the notebook where both of them could see it without making a performance of the offer, and Robert leaned over and compared his sketch to Ezra Brower's cross-section diagram, running his pencil along the margin annotations, with the concentration of a man finding his own approximation confirmed and corrected simultaneously. "Your great-grandfather drew this," Robert said. "Not a question." The handwriting and the age of the paper told the story clearly enough. Wilhelm turned to the temperature record. He kept records for 30 winters. Same structure, different years. The results don't vary by much. He turned back to the foundation diagram. The wall thickness is the part most people would think to argue with. Seems like waste until you understand it's not insulation, it's storage. You're not trying to keep cold out. You're trying to accumulate heat in. Robert looked at the diagram with the revised understanding that single sentence produced, and the look was the specific expression of a man watching something he'd been looking at from the wrong angle suddenly resolve into its correct interpretation. He turned to a fresh sheet of brown paper and began redrawing, this time with the interior thermal mass logic driving the proportions rather than the exterior visual impression. The second evening, Hans sat with the notebook after the children were asleep, and the cabin had arranged itself into the quieter configuration of adults in various states of rest, and Margaret moved her chair from the east wall to the table. She didn't ask to join him. She sat down with her account ledger, which Earl had brought over with her change of clothes that afternoon, and opened it to the pages she'd been unable to work through during the storm days. The two of them worked in parallel at the same table in the same lamplight for an hour without speaking, each occupied with their own record keeping, and the silence between them had none of the charged quality of avoidance. It had the quality of two people comfortable enough in each other's presence to be genuinely occupied rather than performatively so. She closed the ledger after a while and looked at what she'd closed it on the horse column, the absent income now represented by blank lines in the projection rows, and sat with it. The stable failed because I built it to specification. Her voice was the operational voice, the one she used when she was reporting rather than confessing, but the line between the two had shifted enough that what came through was more than report. To what the county carpenters recommended, to what everyone in this territory uses for livestock housing. She looked at the notebook on his side of the table. You built to something older, something that had been tested. Hans was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was deciding whether the full answer or the useful portion of the full answer was what the moment called for. My grandfather built his first structure after the winter of 1815 killed two of his horses and nearly killed his oldest son. He didn't build to what the county recommended after that. He built to what he'd learned. Margaret's eyes moved to the bandaged hand on the table, not with self-consciousness, but with the flat acknowledgement of someone taking inventory. I tried to have your construction reviewed by the territory office. In September, I told Franklin how there were habitability concerns. The acknowledgement sat in the air between them. Hans had known this, had known it, since August had absorbed it and built past it the way you build past a load-bearing obstacle, rather than through it, incorporating the resistance into the structure, rather than fighting it. He looked at her across the table with the unhurried attention of a man who has decided that fairness requires receiving a difficult statement with the same steadiness you'd want someone to receive one of yours. You had reasons. I had wrong ones. She said it with the precision of someone making a technical correction rather than a moral confession, which was the most honest form of accountability she knew how to offer. I thought the precedent was the danger, that an unusual structure would undermine the standards that hold a community together. That was what I told myself. She paused. What I didn't account for was the possibility that the community's standards were incomplete, that there might be things the standards hadn't been tested against. Hans turned the notebook to the temperature records and placed it where she could reach it. She turned pages, slowly reading with the same triangulating attention she'd brought to it that morning, but with different purpose now. Not evaluation, but the specific retrospective arithmetic of a person calculating what a different decision made at the correct time would have produced. If I'd built a structure like this for my stable. She stopped. The arithmetic was complete, and its result was not one she needed to speak aloud for either of them to know it. The third morning, Elias found Hans in the enclosure before breakfast, before anyone else was moving in the cabin above them. He had come down the interior stairs with the purpose of a man who has been forming something through the night hours and intends to deliver it before the momentum of formed intention dissolves in the complications of daylight and company. He stood in the enclosure with the animals moving around both of them, and he said what he'd come to say, without the preamble that a less honest man would have used to soften the approach. I burned 18 cords this winter. He held Hans's eye with the specific effort of someone maintaining contact that costs something to maintain. Everything I stacked, nearly everything I owned in combustible form. My bed frame, half my fence rails, the chair Clara's mother gave her when we left Ohio. A pause that was doing the work of acknowledging the full weight of what those objects represented. The chair was not a chair, it was the last physical object from a life that no longer existed, and he had fed it to a fire that could have been prevented. You used 4, and your house was warm enough to hold 3 families. Hans waited. He had the patience for the sentence that was coming, had known it would come eventually, had not known when or from whom, had prepared for it in the way you prepare for something you've been working toward without being certain of arrival. Teach me to build this. Elias's voice had the particular quality of a man saying something that requires him to be entirely different from what he's been, at least in this one specific direction, at least with this one specific person. Not because I owe you anything, because I can't go into another winter in that cabin, and I can't do that to my family again. Teach me because you know how and I don't, and that's the only thing that matters now. Hans picked up the temperature log and handed it to him. Start there, read every entry from October through today. When you've read it, come find me. He picked up the bedding fork. Then we'll go look at your land and see what stone you've got. When Robert heard about the exchange from Grace, who had heard it from Clara, he waited until the afternoon and then found Hans at the east wall of the enclosure checking a ventilation gap that had partially sealed with ice overnight. He stood outside the gap while Hans worked it clear with a tool and offered the only equivalent he had available. I've got fieldstone in on the north quarter of my property that's been there since we arrived. I thought it was a nuisance. I've been farming around it for 4 years. He paused. I'd like you to come look at it before spring. Tell me if it's workable. The families left on the 30th of January. The departure had the organized practicality of people who have been living in close quarters and have learned each other's operational rhythms and are now unpacking those rhythms in the direction of return. Children gathered belongings. Sleds were loaded with the careful priority of people who have spent 3 days thinking clearly about what actually mattered. Clara folded the quilt she'd used with a precision that was different from her arrival, folding the precision of someone who has been warm and is trying to extend the warmth by caring for the objects associated with it. Elias shook Hans's hand at the cabin door. He held it for a moment past the social duration, which was the only form of extension available to a man of his particular emotional vocabulary, and what he put into the extended grip was the weight of 4 months of public opposition and 3 days of private reconsideration, and everything between those two facts that wouldn't fit into language. Hans received it without performance. There was nothing theatrical in either man's face. There was simply the acknowledgement that something had been established between them that was of a different category than what had been there before. Robert shook hands with the warmth of someone who naturally expresses what Elias naturally contains, and Grace touched Wilhelm's shoulder briefly on the way out in the gesture of an adult who recognizes a young person who has been exceptional without making a spectacle of saying so. The children left in the organized noise of released energy pouring out the door into the cold morning with the enthusiasm of people who have been good for several days and have reached their limit. Margaret was the last. She stood at the cabin door with her coat on and her account ledger under her arm and her bandaged hand at her side, and she looked at Hans with the full, direct, unbuffered attention that she usually reserved for business transactions of significant consequence. She had spent 3 days in this house and had arrived at certain conclusions about it and about its builder that were not the conclusions she'd carried when she first stopped her horse at the property line in August, and she was not the kind of woman who was comfortable pretending otherwise. My sawmill holds a supply of Pennsylvania granite that came in on a delivery contract last spring, she said. I haven't found the right application for it. If you have neighbors who are going to be building foundations this spring, and I expect you will, I can provide the stone at a rate that reflects what the material actually costs, rather than what the market would bear from people who know they need it. She paused for exactly the right length of time. Consider it an adjustment for a miscalculation I made in September. Hans stood in the doorway with the coal pressing past the threshold on both sides of him. He looked at the offer and at the person making it, and he saw in both the same quality he respected most in structural work, the willingness to correct an error by doing the thing correctly rather than by arguing about whether the error had occurred. I'll send Elias to you first, he said. His foundation will be the largest. She walked to her horse, where Earl waited with it at the gate, and she mounted with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has done it daily for years, and she turned the horse toward the road. Hans stood in the doorway and watched her go, and the watching had the quality of attention that had shifted categories without announcing the shift, the kind of attention that is no longer purely professional and has not yet named what it is, but is something that the person paying it is aware of and is not trying to redirect. Wilhelm was standing at the west window, observing this with the specific interest of a 13-year-old who has been paying attention to adults for 3 days in close quarters and has developed as a result a more detailed map of their interior states than any of them would probably wish. He said nothing about what he'd observed. He helped Hans move the extra pallets back to the storage area and reset the cabin to its 2-person configuration, and then he went back to school on the 1st of February with the posture of someone who has recently had a significant experience and carries it differently than a boy carries ordinary weeks. Thomas Larkin did not ask about the cow barn on the first day back. He didn't ask on the second day either. By the end of the week, it was apparent that the particular cruelty Thomas had been practicing was no longer available to him as a social instrument, not because he had been told to stop, or because Wilhelm had responded in a way that shut it down, but because the people Thomas needed to perform for had received sufficient information about the winter to make the performance counterproductive. When the Strand children, all four of them, arrived at school on the 3rd of February, with the unremarkable normalcy of children who have survived something through no effort of their own and have therefore lost the specific experience of extreme cold that was the topic's actual content, the topic itself became difficult to sustain as entertainment. By March, the community's children had reorganized their understanding along the lines the community's adults were busy reorganizing along, which is how the values of a community actually shift, not through proclamation, but through the accumulation of witnessed results. Margaret began rebuilding her stable in February, 3 weeks after losing her horses, and she did not wait for spring, because she had decided that waiting for spring was how the previous stable had gotten built on inadequate principles with time pressure, removed you build to what's conventional, and then the unconventional winter arrives and shows you the cost of convention. She contracted the same carpenter who had built the original structure, sat him down at her study desk, and walked him through a modified design she had worked out over 5 evenings with paper and the memory of everything she had observed and asked and absorbed during 3 days in Hans's cabin. The new stable would not be a full house. Barn integration, the existing foundation couldn't support that scope without a complete rebuild, and she needed horses before spring, not after a summer of construction. But the principles were there applied as far as the existing structure allowed a partial stone foundation added to the north and west walls, where the prevailing wind drove the worst of the cold, heavier corner posts set on stone pads to eliminate the frost, heave that had been cracking the original sill plates, and an interior air circulation design that moved the horses' combined body heat through the space rather than letting it pool at the ceiling while the floor zone remained cold. The carpenter objected to the stonework as excessive for the timeline. Margaret heard him out and then told him to build to the specifications. He built to the specifications. When the first horses arrived in early March, the stable held at 38 degrees on a -15 night with a single small stove running at half capacity. Margaret noted this in her ledger with the same precision she brought to revenue entries. It was a number that meant something different than a revenue entry, but the discipline of recording it accurately was the same. February moved through its length with the cold of a season past its worst, but not yet tired of making itself known. Elias came to Hans on the 8th with questions about his North Quarter's stone supply, which he'd assessed in the week after returning home with the eyes of someone who had recently been taught what to look for. The stone was workable granite fieldstone, consistent in quality and sufficient in volume for a foundation smaller than Hans's, but adequate for the family it needed to serve. Hans walked the quarter with him on a Saturday morning, pointing at specific outcrops and explaining what the coloration indicated about hardness and about how the stone would behave under sustained load. Elias listened the way he'd listened to the notebook reading in the concentrated silence of a man replacing a previous framework with a corrected one, installing new information over the structures where the wrong information had been stored. Robert came with them on the second walk, bringing his revised brown paper drawings, and the three of them stood in the February cold over the drawings and the stone and talked about design in the practical language of men who are discussing something they're going to build rather than something they're going to argue about, which is a categorically different kind of conversation. Hans answered questions without hierarchy and without the undercurrent of demonstration that poisons the transfer of practical knowledge when the person with the knowledge is still defending the right to have it. Anders Olsen appeared at the edge of the property during the second walk, having ridden down from the North Road on what was officially an errand to the feed store and was actually something else. He stood at the fence line and watched the three men moving over the stone outcrop with the unmistakable body language of someone conducting an assessment they intend to act on. When Hans came back to the gate, Anders was still there. He had questions of his own about the stone on his North Quarter, which he described in enough detail that Hans could already picture its character, and about whether a smaller family and a smaller budget could still apply the same principles at reduced scale. Hans told him what he had told Elias: come look at the stone first, then talk about what's possible. Anders rode to the feed store and then came back. March arrived and softened the territory's edges in the incremental way of a season that understands it's unwelcome and is trying not to make its absence too abrupt. The snow retreated from the road margins first, and then from the south-facing slopes, and then slowly from the general field level, and the granite outcrops on Elias's north quarter began to emerge from the white with the inevitability of things that have been waiting for conditions to become workable. Elias broke ground on his foundation in the second week of March, before the frost was fully out of the soil because the frost was close enough to out, and the season was not prepared to wait for his comfort. He worked with Robert on the days Robert could be spared from his own spring preparation, and Anders Olsen joined them on 2 Saturdays learning the process by being in it, which is the only way the process can actually be learned. Hans came on a Thursday in the third week of March once unannounced. He walked the work slowly, looking at the corner placement and the mortar lines in the wall width Elias had achieved. At the northeast corner, he crouched and looked at the inner face and ran his hand along the joint between two specific stones. This section needs another 3 inches on the inside face here. You can set it without disturbing the rest. The bond above hasn't cured fully yet. He stood and walked the south wall and found nothing that needed correction. He walked back to the gate where he'd tied his horse and rode home. Elias looked at the northeast corner for a while after Hans left. Then he mortared in the additional course exactly as directed, the way a man accepts correction from someone whose credentials are the work itself rather than the title on a door. Margaret came to the homestead twice in March for what her communications called stone delivery coordination, which was the accurate description of the visit's primary content. The first time she came with Earl and a written list of granite dimensions available at the mill yard, which Hans reviewed at the cabin table, while she stood at the counter and looked at the current state of the room with the interest of someone who has been in it under different conditions and is recalibrating the standing impression. The business portion of the meeting was efficient. The portion after the business portion was less efficient in the specific way of conversations that have found a natural ending point and have then continued past it without either party quite choosing to end them. The second March visit produced a conversation about the previous August that had the quality of 2 people examining a document they both have in front of them and noting the discrepancies between what it says and what they'd separately understood it to mean. Margaret said what she'd done and why in the plain voice she used for accurate accounting. Hans said what he'd understood and how he'd responded in the same voice. The exchange had the specific intimacy of 2 people who are honest with each other about things that are embarrassing to be honest about, which is a more reliable foundation for most relationships than the more dramatic kinds of honesty tend to be. She left at 4 in the afternoon with the conversation's natural conclusion established and a follow-up meeting about the Finch Properties Foundation stone requirements scheduled for 2 weeks out. Hans watched the road after she'd gone with a particular quality of attention that was becoming identifiable to him as something specific, a new category of interest that he hadn't had occasion to notice until now, because the only other time he'd felt it, he'd been 23 years old in Lancaster County and hadn't yet learned to recognize what he was feeling before it had already reorganized his life. He went inside and opened the notebook to a fresh page and sat with the pencil for a while without writing. Then he wrote the date and the temperature and the note about the Elias Foundation's northeast corner correction and closed the notebook and put it in his breast pocket. On the last day of March, Wilhelm came home from school with the information that Thomas Larkin's father had asked after the foundation design at the feed store. Hans made no comment on this. He noted it in the margin of that day's temperature entry with a single abbreviation, closed the notebook, and went out to check the enclosure, which by March smelled like early spring instead of winter, a different quality in the air, the season's arrival detectable through the livestock's behavior before any thermometer registered it. The animals moved with more energy. They had come through. April put the final cord of firewood untouched in the storage area. Hans counted it on the 1st of April the way he counted everything without ceremony, with accuracy as a verification rather than a celebration. 1 cord, 2 months of winter consumed by cooking fires rather than survival fires, not one emergency stoke of the heating stove that hadn't been planned and predicted. He recorded the final winter tally in the notebook: 5 cords purchased, 4 cords consumed, 1 cord remaining. Differential maintained at design specification throughout season. Storm period 3 days consumed 1 1/3 cords. System performed within all predicted parameters. He turned to the previous page and read the full winter's record from November through April, reading the way his grandfather had read his own records, as evidence rather than memory, as the kind of proof that doesn't require an audience to be valid. The numbers confirmed what his feet had confirmed every morning when he came down from the enclosure, that the design was not a theory that had been tested and found adequate. It was a practice that had been tested and found correct. Spring turned the territory green in the determined way of a landscape that was not asking for permission. The pastures came back from under the snow with a speed that always surprised settlers who had not yet spent enough seasons here to understand that Minnesota's capacity for recovery was equal to its capacity for severity. Elias's foundation rose through April and into May. With the reliable pace of determined work, the stone courses adding themselves to the previous courses, the way any accumulated effort accumulates one honest unit at a time without drama. Anders Olsson's smaller foundation went up alongside his through May, the two men working neighboring projects and trading observations the way men trade tools freely and without accounting. Wilhelm went to school in April with the version of himself that the winter had produced, which was different in ways that were visible to people paying attention and invisible to people who weren't. The boy who had inherited his mother's directness had added to it something more, his father's patience for results, a willingness to let the work be the argument rather than the argument be the argument. He was not performing equanimity. He had simply been through something, and the through had changed the shape of what came out the other side. The sawmill ran at full capacity in April and May, rebuilding the lumber inventory that the winter's demand had drawn down. Margaret supervised the operation with the same competence she had always brought to it, but the competence sat differently now, oriented towards something beyond the immediate operational excellence that had been its own sufficient purpose for 5 years. She found herself making decisions with a longer time horizon than the season or the contract building, towards something that required more than one pair of hands and one person's vision, which was a new quality in her planning, a quality she examined with the careful interest of someone who has discovered an unexpected feature in familiar terrain. She and Hans met 4 more times before July, each time for purposes that were accurate and also partial. The stone for Robert's foundation, the consultation on the Olson family's new homestead, designed the question of whether the sawmill's off-cut timber could be profitably used for thermal mass augmentation in existing structures. Each meeting was honest about its stated content, and honest too about the content alongside the stated content. The growing familiarity between two people who communicate primarily through the quality of their attention and are therefore more transparent to each other than most people who communicate through words. July arrived with the specific generosity of a Minnesota summer that seems to be compensating for the winter. It has just put everyone through warm days that held their warmth until after dark evenings on the prairie, that had the quality of something offered freely rather than earned, the grass green and high, and moving in the evening wind, like the territory was demonstrating what it looked like when it wasn't trying to kill you. On a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of July, Hans and Wilhelm sat on the cabin's exterior, landing the broad platform at the top of the exterior staircase, a feature Hans had built wide enough to serve as outdoor sitting space in the summer months, which was an amenity he had not specifically designed for but had incorporated as a consequence of designing the other features correctly. The sun was an hour from the horizon, and the light was the particular gold of late afternoon, the kind of light that makes practical things look briefly like something more than practical things, and the prairie stretched from the property line to the tree line and from the tree line to the sky without interruption. Hans opened the notebook to the last used page and turned past it to the first clean page. He held the pencil and looked at the page for a moment with the quality of someone preparing to add something to a document that matters to them, not just recording data, but contributing to something that has been building longer than his own involvement in it. He wrote the date. He drew a scaled sketch of the homestead as it currently stood, with the foundation dimensions and the cabin dimensions, and the enclosure layout and the orientation relative to the road and the granite outcrop. He wrote the final winter temperature record summary. The differential maintained the cord consumption, the storm performance. He wrote the names of the 3 families who had come through the storm season here. He wrote Elias Strand, new foundation, begun March 15th, projected completion, July. He wrote Robert Finch, stone assessment, completed design consultation, February through April. He wrote Anders Olson, North Road Foundation, begun May cabin raising, planned August. Wilhelm watched the sketch take shape and then looked at the summer evening beyond the railing with the expression of a boy who is beginning to understand the timescale he exists within the generations that precede and follow his own specific moment, the way what a man builds outlasts him if he builds it honestly. Why do you always write it down? The question was genuine rather than rhetorical, asked from a new angle rather than the old one. Hans kept his pencil moving through the property dimensions. Because your grandfather wrote it down. Because I found it when I needed it. He finished the sketch and moved the pencil to the margin. Because someday you'll be 40 and you'll have a son who asks you why you build the way you build, and you'll want to be able to show him rather than just tell him. Telling is easy. Showing requires that you kept the record. Wilhelm took the pencil when Hans set it down and turned to the corner of the page where the margins were widest. He wrote carefully with the deliberate hand of someone who understands they are adding to a document rather than simply writing on a page. Wilhelm H. Brower, Lancaster County, native Minnesota Territory, 1853. The winter of 1856 to 1857. Everything we knew was true. Hans read it. He looked at his son with the expression of a man who has been given something he didn't know to anticipate, which is the best kind of gift because it arrives without the diminishment that expectation produces. He put the notebook back in his breast pocket and sat in the long evening light and let the silence between them be what it was, not absence but presence. The presence of two people who have arrived at a mutual understanding that doesn't require verification through language. The sound of hoofbeats came along the road from the south before they saw the horse, and the horse came into view with the particular purposeful walk of an animal that knows where it is going and is comfortable with the journey. Margaret Caldwell was in the saddle with her back straight and her gray coat catching the late light, and a cloth-covered basket tied to the pommel that was not by any available interpretation a business delivery. She turned in at the property gate without slowing and walked the horse to the base of the exterior stairs and looked up at the two of them on the landing. The basket held a covered apple cake she had made it herself, which Earl would later confirm with the amused certainty of a man who understood the significance of Margaret Caldwell doing something in the kitchen that she had not done since her husband was alive. She did not explain the cake or the visit. She untied the basket from the pommel and held it out, and the offering was complete in itself, not requiring context or justification, the act of a woman who had decided what she wanted and had arrived, which was the only way Margaret Caldwell did anything. Hans stood up from the landing chair and started down the stairs. The evening was warm, and the light was the gold that the prairie had been offering for free all summer, and the notebook was in his breast pocket, where it had always been carrying the evidence of one man's conviction across 2 generations, and one terrible winter carrying his son's name in fresh ink beside the entries his grandfather had started carrying, the record of a design that had done what designs do when they are built honestly held. Wilhelm watched his father reach the foot of the stairs and watch Margaret dismount, and watched the two of them stand in the July evening below the structure that had started all of this, and he understood with the particular comprehension of a boy who has been paying close attention for 13 years that he was watching a beginning rather than a conclusion. He stood up from his chair, went inside the cabin, and came back out. A moment later, carrying the chair from beside the stove, the extra chair, the one that hadn't been needed in this house for a long time, and would be needed now, and set it on the landing with the two that were already there. He didn't say anything. He sat back down in his own chair and looked at the summer evening and let his father open the gate.